So they're quite serious when they talk about using science and technology for national defense. You could make an argument that the reason they are building TELs is not just a new missile type, but also a desire to maximize their ability to fire multiple shots simultaneously in the field. They have many more missiles than they do TELs. So they're constrained somewhat by the number of TELs. If they want to, let's say they have 60 TELs, I don't know, for short-range missiles. It's probably 50 or 60 or something like that. And if they want to overwhelm a ballistic missile defense system, they would have to fire a lot of those simultaneously to swamp the system's capacity to handle that. Presumably the first thing you would attack is the defense itself, and then you move on to other targets. But, you know, if that takes 20, 30 shots simultaneously, that's a third to a half of your shots for that first round. Then you have to go reload the TELs. And you're vulnerable to being tanked, because when you fire a missile like that, you are announcing your coordinates to the world. The United States has satellites that persistently stare down at most of the Earth, watching for the flame of missile launches, so they can pinpoint it very precisely. And building their own TEL is a way of eliminating this battlefield bottleneck, because it means you would not have to go back and reload. You can launch from some hidden spot out in the field. If you have 100, 200 of these things, you can have 100 or 200 shots simultaneously.
Now, Josh, can you provide us some kind of comparative assessment of where the production capability of the North Koreans fits with other countries that may not be pursuing TELs or have any aspirations for nuclear weapons or missiles, but simply in terms of defense industry, where does it compare to South Korea, to Japan, to a host of other major industrial?
Well, certainly when it comes to missile technology, they're ahead of the South Koreans. At least for space launchers and long-range missiles.
I'm more interested not in the missile technology so much as the utility of these machines.
Okay. I'd say that a good point of reference is Iran. I'd say they're well ahead of Iran. When it comes to Japan and South Korea, those are industrial powerhouses, and I would be reluctant to put them on the same plane. I would say that we have a bit of a conundrum in talking about North Korea, because everyone's prevailing image is the satellite photo at night that shows the largely dark country. But the reason it's dark is because all the electricity goes to the military factories. That's why it's dark. I mean, they can produce more electricity if they want to. Now that the Chinese have cut off most coal imports, in fact, I understand that the cities are getting more reliable electricity because they got this coal. So what are they going to do? Well, we might as well send it to the coal-fired power plant and make some electricity. It's just not a priority. They would rather get the money for the coal and divert it probably to their primary preoccupation, which is the defense industry. They have an extensive industrial base, largely underground, for making munitions, vehicles, a few fairly basic aircraft, really not very impressive. Tanks, self-propelled artillery, they have a lot of shipyards, they have, just in numeric terms, the #1 or #2 submarine fleet in the world, the other one being Russia. They're small subs. You probably would not want to be on them. They're death traps. But ask the South Koreans if those aren't a serious military asset. So in fact, they've exported some of their small subs. So I would say it is a serious industrial capacity. It is hard to measure because we don't have useful statistics. They don't share export statistics. They don't The only industrial statistics they share are obviously fake and fairly high level and not very informative. The production always rises, and you know, we're making more steel than ever, and so forth. I would just say this: in the 90s, they gave up on having 5-year, 6-year, 7-year plans in the classic Soviet style. It gave up on the planned economy. It collapsed. When the Soviet aid ended around 89, 90, things went downhill very quickly. They did, however, institute science and technology multi-year plans around that time, and they probably still have them. One of the things that they introduced, I believe it was this January, was a new 5-year plan. So they are a 5-year plan for economic development. So they are back in business from their perspective and building up this command socialist economy. And the reality of North Korea today, as attested by many defectors, and you can actually now see it in satellite photos as well, is that it is a marketized economy. There are sanctioned marketplaces where people do business, although tourists generally are not allowed to see them because it's not the official face of North Korea. They don't talk about the markets in their propaganda. But I guess I would say they are experiencing economic growth. They are expanding their defense industry. They are renovating it. They are clearly improving the production technology. Although what we're seeing here is a showcase facility. This is what they want for the entire defense industry, and it remains to be seen how far they will take it. But I think the very fact that it is an impoverished country with terrible infrastructure is just a flip side of what we see here. All the resources are going here. Yes?
In your opinion, what is the goal of all this? Is it defensive, or do they have imperialist intent in mind? Have they given up taking over South Korea, for example?
The answer is yes. It's both. Their primary concern right now is defense. They know they're massively outgunned by the United States and South Korea together, by the United States alone, possibly by South Korea alone, although they wouldn't admit that. That's how they justify developing nuclear weapons. They don't have an ally to protect them. They have a big threat breathing down their neck in combined exercises twice a year and out there in general. So their main requirements are defensive. Having said that, I think the reason that they've invested in ICBM technology is they would like to drive a wedge between the United States and South Korea, get the United States eventually to leave South Korea, get the United States to downgrade its alliance, and eventually use their ability to intimidate the North Koreans, the South Koreans with their nuclear and missile capabilities, and to appeal to the younger generation there that hasn't known war with nationalist themes, solidarity. Bill asked about that marketing photograph of the Yonhap factory floor, and I said it's from the Order Zokuri website. That means our nation by itself. And that website and broadcaster are aimed at South Koreans primarily. So it uses nationalist appeals and shows off the high tech in North Korea, most of it military or at minimum dual use, as a way of trying to stir Korean pride among young South Koreans.
So they haven't given up their goal to take over the South?
No, but it's very long range. And I mean, the South hasn't given up its goal of taking over the North. Neither side sees the other as a legitimate entity. When they spell out North Korea and South Korea in their propaganda, they always use the lowercase n and s, because for them, those are geographic references. There's only one Democratic Republic, the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, as far as they're concerned. And they are not going to acknowledge the Republic of Korea. They're not going to use the formal name of the South Korean state, and the South Koreans return the favor. they're exactly the same way. They always refer to the North as North Korea, never as the DPRK. Yes?
Where does their foreign exchange come from?
Well, that's a good question. It's changed quite a bit. It's claimed that up to a third of their income in the last decade has been coal shipments to China. I don't know if that's correct or not. We have to reconstruct this through what are called shadow statistics. Essentially, you have to look at customs data from the rest of the world and see what they report is going in and out of North Korea, because the North Koreans don't report it. And that is a whole art. I'm not a practitioner of that dark art, but it's difficult because often countries will miscategorize data as being North Korean when it's South Korean. So Mexico for 1 year allegedly imported scads of cell phones from North Korea. And clearly that was not right. So what you need to do is a lot of sifting and to clean up the data. And then that doesn't tell you about illicit forms of trade that the country on the other hand also is not reporting, such as the arms trade. Typically they don't report it. Now, there are many countries actually where they don't know that the North Korean arms industry is sanctioned, and they just, But increasingly they're catching on, the customers catching on. You don't publicize this. You don't talk about it. You don't report your customs data to the UN when you import a bunch of North Korean small arms or communications equipment. So we get, there are basically two sources on how much money they're making from arms exports. One is whatever the South Korean think tanks come up with, and God knows how they come up with that. And the other are interdictions. Occasionally, once, twice a year maybe, a sanctioned shipment will be seized and will get reported to the UN. So that's the short answer. Yes?
Could you help me get my brain around the machining systems a little bit? You said that they are used for hardening aluminum or steel, generally for missile casings or
centrifuge rotors.
Yeah.
You're talking about flow forming machines.
flow forming machines. Okay.
Yeah. Or
And then
flow forming lathes, it's the same thing.
flow forming lathes. Could you kind of step me through the process a little bit about how that exactly works? How do you harden steel to the level of quality that you can use it for a sophisticated equipment?
Well, it's called cold working. It's done at room temperature. And so what you do is you take the see that gray tube standing on end on the machine in the background there. That's probably pre-filled. What you do is you forge a steel tube, and then you stick it on that black shape in the foreground, the mandrel. So you mount it there, it gets spun very rapidly, and then the rollers squeeze it. So it actually gets flattened out, it gets compressed, so it's very thin and elongated. If you want to find examples of that, you walk around, you look at metal light poles or flagpoles. It's typically how they're made. For whatever reasons, and I'm not a metallurgist, with certain alloys, if you compress them under real pressure at room temperature, it actually strengthens as a result. So,
And the technology is like having very high graded compression or high graded steel or marriaging steel is sort of a taboo. Like only some countries can do it, and some countries simply don't have the technology or the capability to do it.
They have a lot of steel metallurgy capabilities. I would not put marriaging steel production beyond their reach at all.
Okay.
Pakistan is doing it. I don't see what North Korea is. But yeah, I mean that we tend to have a lot of prejudice against the North Koreans. We see them as not capable, and the result is they surprise us again and again. They've never acknowledged having American steel production. They don't advertise that. I suspect it's probably considered a state secret, but then again, maybe they don't make it.
I'm working on an article that says that they do make it. It's not very, very high quality marriaging steel, but it is technically marriaging steel. So
Well, let's talk,
yeah, all right, okay.
because I've got all kinds of stuff on that. So
It sounds a little pedantic, but the ability to be able to do that is sort of countries ratcheting up with their overall capabilities, so really interesting stuff.
Yep. Yes.
The 18th January General Machinery Factory is in South Pyongyang, right?
I think so.
Interesting to note, they also, it's an older facility, but they have a set of sound isolators for testing gas turbines there
Is that right?
and jet engines. I put together a bunch of pictures if you want to stop by my office later.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, this is, there's been like I said, a big process of expansion and renovation underway at a lot of these plants, which you can see in the above ground components. And you can just see underground, it's often very spiffy and new, and some of the machinery looks new, and so on. Robert?
Yeah, you'd mentioned that the Ryonha had a foreign JV partner, and I was just curious if there is any data that you've run across of that type of business arrangement in reverse. In other words, where North Korean firms are engaging in JVs with firms in China. And I'm thinking specifically as this could be an acquisition pathway for the foreign manufacturing technologies, the equipment that's been sort of illustrated here.
Well, joint venture means just that, joint venture, two partners at a minimum. And when the North Koreans use that term, they seem to mean foreign partner, but they've never disclosed who that partner is, and do not always emphasize that. I've often thought that the name of the plant is some kind of hint. It's not a Korean name. They never translate it. When you look at the Chinese characters they use for it, it means Lotus River. But that doesn't mean anything in China. That's not I mean, maybe there are shops in various Chinatowns in America that might use a name like that, but it's just, you won't find anything much on the Chinese internet that uses that. So there's some kind of odd clue in the name, but I've never quite figured out who or what is behind head in Chinese. So yeah, I expect that they do use joint ventures to acquire the production technology. You can see certain commonalities between their machines and some other machines, including from Chinese manufacturers. But they're good at getting design information by hook or by crook, and it's not really clear. They are willing to transfer production technology in some cases. We've seen that in the missile program where they helped set up ballistic missile factories in a handful of other countries. The submarine program that I mentioned, they exported a few of their smaller submarines to Iran over a decade ago. I don't remember exactly when. And then the Iranians started making their own. So it seems that they share the production lines. And, that's something that everybody wants. Everybody wants control over their own technology ultimately. Not everyone is equally confident they can handle it, but when you're confident you can, it tends to be a demand for technology transfer. Yes.
Can we talk a little bit more about their submarine program? Are we seeing machines of the size that could handle building their own engines for their own submarines as well? Or we have not seen those yet?
I haven't been looking for it. They really don't make a habit of showing the insides of their shipyards. Photos of anything revealing of their shipyards are pretty rare. There are things you can see at various other facilities that may be related to any variety of things. But I've never been able to draw that connection, to look for it. But I have to also learn what to look for. They certainly do make diesel engines. They've been making trucks and tractors since the late 50s. They have a modern V12 engine factory that recently built, as we just saw. And while I'm sure that a diesel engine for a submarine is quite a bit different. It's really a diesel electric. I don't think that technology is out there just offhand. I'd be surprised. They've been building subs and ships for
a
years.
different scale of forming machine, different scale of blade than
Well, I'm not sure you would need any of this for
that
engines.
size.
I mean, the application of these in the automotive industry, for example, is hubcaps. I don't think it necessarily contributes to engines. And the reason that I dwelled on this here is because I suspect it's related to solid missiles, not to the tails. I could be wrong, but
Certain qualities.
To what extent do the Chinese adhere to the UN export controls? Is that
what day of the week is it? I mean, I think they've gotten better about that because they're more motivated. They are very unhappy with this, but export controls are, I think it goes against the Chinese grain. They were the ones trying to beat those things for decades. And now, being on the other side of the fence doesn't seem to come naturally to them. But they've been training their customs people in ports that deal with Koreans. They've been cracking down on coal imports, and they even when they're really unhappy with the North Koreans, they actually start threatening their oil exports. They send crude oil and a few other products, a few refined products to North Korea, and when they get unhappy, they threaten it. I think it was after the first nuclear test that mysteriously the crude oil pipeline had a technical fault that put it out of business for 3 days. In the last few years, there's been no record of any crude oil been exporting. The Chinese now say that is recorded as aid. So they don't provide the statistics, and that gives them the advantage of when they want to coerce the North Koreans, they can do it without publicly humiliating them because there's no visible numbers that drop. So, you know, it's not really clear. There's no simple answer, but the United States leans on them all the time to do more. They're responsible for something like 80 to 90% of North Korea's known foreign trade these days. And you know, that's you know, minus the arms exports, which no one really knows the scale of. Simply because the Japanese and South Koreans have sanctioned themselves out of trade relations with them, and the Chinese are the ones who are left to pick up the pieces. So there's a lot that goes through China, and they've never been super assiduous about this, but now they're starting to get tougher because they really are very unhappy with how the North Koreans conduct themselves. Yes?
I'm not sure I understand all your presentation, but I wonder if they have capacity to develop such kind of machines without exporting, without importing some component to other side actors, because their ideology is based on Juche, so I think they are aiming to the kind of direction to develop themselves. I think so. Do you think currently do you think if they have capacity to develop the kind of machine?
Eventually, in time. They have this aspiration to do it themselves, and that's something that they've emphasized more and more. There was a speech by Kim Jong-il to, I think, the party central committee in the mid-'80s that you can find online, in which he chided them for doing a really poor job of importing foreign production technology, and said how they do it in another country, which was his way of referring to South Korea, is they bring in foreign factories entirely. And he chided them, he said, you cannot turn away people and discourage people who come to you with foreign technology and say that's not Juche. It's perfectly consistent with Juche. Why should we reinvent things we can we can acquire these capabilities, these technologies at a small fraction of the cost by importing them. And so that is very much the philosophy they've adopted since the late 80s. They even passed a law to institutionalize this process in the late 80s, where they are scanning world technological developments, trying to identify what's relevant for their own needs, trying to get a hold of it, and then trying to duplicate it themselves. So they try to be selective, but it all starts with foreign developments. And it's really more about assimilating foreign origin technology than inventing their own. They emphasize now that when it comes to missiles, they're now designing their own missiles. They're not just copying foreign missiles anymore. That's been one of their themes in the past year. But it took a while to get to that point. For a while, they were copying and adapting rocket engines of Soviet designs, reconfiguring them, building them locally, despite what you may have heard, but really adhering pretty closely to the original design principles. And now they're starting to move away from that and become more innovative in the field. So there clearly is a progression, and it takes some time to get to that stage, decades. But it begins with imports, and then imports of design information, and goes from there.
Could you address what's going on today with North Korea, the Chinese, and the American government? What is your best view as to what's going on and how it will be resolved?
I think that the Trump administration is leaning on the Chinese to do more. The Chinese, in turn, are indeed making threatening noises towards the North Koreans about considering the supply of crude oil. And I think the Chinese are waiting for this to blow over. Just my educated guess that Trump will be distracted by some bright shiny object and the next crisis, or he'll be impeached, or God knows. So they are displeased with the North Koreans, first of all, because they don't like being defied. And all the things that the North Koreans do here defy the will of the Chinese. Chinese have said, let us protect you, we can give you security assurances. They also have, you can have these slides if anybody wants them. You can, at the same time, they also pressure them, condemn them at the UN. They sign on to all these resolutions. So they're continually telling the North Koreans, don't do that. Do what we tell you to, accept our protection, everything will be fine. And the North Koreans aren't having it. At the same time, they're also upset because everything the North Koreans do to provoke the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Americans, rebounds on the Chinese as well. For instance, in '98, the North Koreans fired their first space launcher over Japan. And that put both the American and Japanese missile defense programs into high gear. And I don't think the Chinese have ever forgiven the North Koreans for that. Incidentally, the North Koreans have said in their propaganda that they could not have built that space launcher without the products of their Yonhap factory. So they tie these things together quite explicitly. Anything else? Are we done? That's it. Great.